It's Vengeance in a Song of Ice and Fire. So basically I had this idea for the panel. I was working on a script for my podcast, and I was studying Oberyn, and I realised, what a strong theme vengeance is. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to take the vengeance stories in A Song of Ice and Fire and study them side by side and see what comes up. So, got this panel together. This is the panel description. Everyone in A Song of Ice and Fire is out for vengeance, or so it seems. Let's look at a few of the more significant revenge arcs, Arya, Sandor, Stoneheart, and Oberyn, to see what can be said about what the author is trying to tell us about a life lived for vengeance. So, welcome. I'm Yolkboy from Radio Westeros.
Gwyn from Radio Westeros.
Hi, Emily of the Eyrie.
I am Mace from Eyrie.
Okay, so the way we're going to do this panel, each one of us is going to take a character. I'm going to pose a few questions and we'll answer for our characters. So I'm going to focus on Stoneheart.
I am Sandor.
Oberyn Martell.
I'm Arya, and you're on my list.
Was this one on, by the way? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you have to
We know
really
you're
try and
very
speak
close.
into it. Yeah, you do. Okay, so let's begin. There's a continuum of justice against revenge that George likes to explore, and sometimes it's difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. If we define justice as the search for fair treatment using laws as a framework with which to judge and punish crimes, and vengeance as a settling of personal scores in a retaliatory manner, where would you place your character on the line? Lady Gwyn.
So, in a recent episode, I commented that Sandor represents that slow burn of rage, which is laser focused on a single person. So he's pretty far along the continuum towards pure vengeance, almost as far as a character can go, actually. His desire for vengeance is so strong. It really consumes everything in its path, including to some extent his own soul and his ability to be a productive member of society. I think it's important to know, because we're talking about this continuum from justice to vengeance, that Sandor's rage, which fuels his desire for vengeance, is actually born from a perceived lack of justice. So for him, that concept of justice on the opposite end of the spectrum is fairly meaningless.
Yeah, so in thinking about Oberyn, I thought a lot about kind of the endless cycle, as Gwyn mentioned, kind of where Sandor's trauma comes from. We see that you can go really far back with all of House Martell and the vengeance that they're seeking. We see that a lot just in the wake of his death. Like, I'm not just going to talk about that up through that when we talk about Oberyn. The Sand Snakes thirst for vengeance of their own for their father. Prince Doran tries to temper that as well as he can. We also hear Ilaria Sand echoing caution because she doesn't want to see her young daughters wrapped up in that endless cycle. But I do want to talk about when Oberyn was still alive, of course. So, where he falls on that justice to vengeance spectrum is a bit murky, I actually found. At first I thought, he's vengeance personified, justice, vengeance, fire, and blood. But, it's hard for him to actually see a path to justice when Tywin is hand of the king. That's a lot of power to go up against. I do not believe that Oberyn came to King's Landing expecting some sort of fair trial for the Mountain or an apology from Tywin or anything like that. He makes that clear instantly when he meets Tyrion. But he does forego certain plans that he kind of floats or throws out there to Tyrion, such as, we could crown Myrcella. He does want to settle the score for Elia, but he goes about it in a way that ultimately forces the entire court to hear Gregor's confession. Even when he's forced to walk that vengeful path, he seeks to create a path for real justice for those who kind of pick up that mantle after him. And so to me, that shows that Oberyn is somewhere a little closer to the middle of that spectrum than you might kind of think at first brush. The primary counterpoint to that being that, in an attempt to seek this pseudo-judicious ending for the Mountain rather than a vengeful one, choosing Tyrion's trial and wrapping up a completely unrelated matter in the process is not exactly the embodiment of justice.
I think similar to Oberyn's, Arya's story forces us to confront the limited ability of punishment to achieve justice, whether that's inside or outside of the law. At first blush, Arya, kind of like Oberyn, she's famous for her list of names, so she seems like she's on this classic quest for personal vengeance, for settling her scores. But by the time we get to A Dance with Dragons, I would argue that her overall arc finds her in a much more complicated place with relationship to this spectrum. At the end of A Storm of Swords, Arya chooses not to kill her once sworn enemy, the Hound, after not only witnessing him prevail in the trial by battle over the death of Micah, but also after trekking the Riverlands at Sandor's side. And so at this point, it feels like part of Arya, at least, is rejecting the idea of personal vengeance symbolized by her list of names. But the concept of impartial justice as law, which I would argue is symbolized very well by the faceless man's kind of cold contract mode of killing, doesn't quite work for Arya either. She memorably and repeatedly breaks the faceless man's rules by killing who she chooses, from Darien, the Night's Watch deserter, to Rafe. So, significantly, I think all of Arya's murders in Bravos link her sense of justice and her list to Arya's sense of her own self and her own rebellion against becoming no one. For Arya, both justice and mercy are always personal. They're as linked to her identity and her family as her two most iconic weapons, needle and Eyrie.
So, thinking about Lady Stoneheart, she's a character we haven't seen much of, if we consider that Catelyn was, of course, very different before the Red Wedding. So there is a degree of speculation when we discuss Stoneheart. However, if we look at the Merrick prologue, where she's first revealed to the reader, we see that there's vestiges of justice in a modus operandi with the BWB. Of course, the BWB were originally sent out by Ned Stark to bring justice to Gregor Clegane, but over time have become jaded outlaws and have allowed corruption to set in over the course of the brutal War of the Five Kings. Thoros of Myr says to Brienne later in Feast, "Justice, I remember justice, it had a pleasant taste. Justice was what we were about when Beric led us, or so we told ourselves. We were kingsmen, knights and heroes. But some nights are dark and full of terrors, my lady. War makes monsters of us all." And so partnering up with a character who was last seen soaring through innocent Jingle Bell's neck is taking the BWB further away from justice and towards vengeance. What's interesting is that Merrick does ask for a trial before he is hanged, and so they give him a sort of sham trial and he's not really allowed to defend himself. Stoneheart's BWB will likely use a bastardized version of justice to justify the killings, I think. Stoneheart will probably refer to the rat cook tale from Northern culture, which not only conveys that guest right is paramount, but that man has a right to vengeance. I see the organisation grasping at straws of corrupted justice when really they're being vengeful. It should be noted that before he's lynched, Merrick claims that the phrase had a right to their own vengeance when Robb humiliated them and broke his promise. The notion that claiming vengeance can lead to an endless cycle of bloodshed, as Emily said, is right there in that story. Okay, so the next question. How did your character find themselves embroiled in revenge? What happened to them to put them on this path? What was the trigger, and why was it so personal to them? Lady Gwyn.
Sandor was, as you all know, was brutally abused by his own brother for the crime of playing with a toy that the older boy had no interest in or the ownership of. So it was really desperately unfair. The toy knight represented the boy Sandor's desire to be a knight, and its association with his abuse has almost certainly affected his perception of knighthood on a really visceral level, especially when, after everything he suffered at the hands of his own brother went unpunished, the crown prince of Westeros turned around and knighted him, which to a young child probably seemed a lot like a reward for being brutal. So not only was Sandor disfigured, suffering great pain in that moment, but forever afterwards, but his childhood dreams were smashed, along with the innate trust that children have in their family and to some extent society, the society around them. So that has obviously colored his entire character arc.
Yeah, much like Sandor, Oberyn was a much younger man when this quest for vengeance began for him. 13, 14 years before the story started. The deaths of his beloved sister Eyrie and her children are certainly his primary motivation, but he reveals that he thinks that this whole twisted revenge arc actually might have started a little bit sooner. He believes that Tywin was seeking revenge on Eyrie when she was chosen over Cersei to wed Prince Rhaegar. So, and he brings this up to Tyrion pretty early. This is a huge part of his motivation to hold Tywin accountable, not just for the murders that happened on his watch, but for that excessive brutality and that kind of streak of revenge. Tyrion thinks about the generational trauma that this quest for vengeance brings about, and Arya again also calls this out later, wondering if her own daughters must die in the cycle of revenge to claim more Lannisters, Martells, and more. As we later meet Doran and his children, as well as Oberyn's own daughters, the Red Viper's motives are similar to his family's, of course, but we find out throughout the story that there's significant disagreement amongst this faction about how to seek for that justice, vengeance, fire, and blood they all want.
Catelyn Stark was a proud mother and a dutiful Tullian Stark. She loved her children and would have happily lived an idyllic life at Winterfell if King Robert hadn't come calling. Her family unit was threatened early on when Bran was nearly killed, and as the story progressed, things went from bad to worse. Her husband was beheaded, and by the time of Edmure's wedding, she believed Arya, Bran, and Rickon are all dead, with Sansa Lannister captive, which she was probably thinking Sansa's dead as well. She feels guilty and devastated and exhausted, with barely enough time to breathe and grieve her losses. Some of her actions, such as releasing Jaime, are referred to by other characters as a mother's madness. But at the twins, we see her true madness, witnessing the Freys breaking guest rights to slaughter her people and then threaten her eldest son was agonizing for her. She says to Walder Frey, "Robb is my son, my first son and my last. Let him go and I will swear we'll forget this. Forget all you've done here. I swear it by the old gods anew. We will take no vengeance." But when Robb is killed, of course, she immediately takes vengeance on Jingle Bell in a fit of madness that then sees her clawing her own face to shreds. Her final words, "Don't cut my hair, Ned loves my hair," haunts all of us. When she's resurrected, she then feeds off the horror that she herself endured at the twins. There's little of Catelyn left, and then the appendix actually refers to her as Mother Merciless.
So Arya has her family and identity stripped from her by war, and by the time we get to A Feast for Crows, a quest for vengeance is all she believes she has left. There's simply no place for Arya Stark of Winterfell. None of her hiding places or disguises last. The hell of war has consumed one after another. It begins with her separation from Nymeria, a wolf who's both part of herself and her link to her family. Then she watches death claim her father, then Yoren, who cut her hair and made her Arya the orphan boy, and on endlessly, Arya finds death at every crossroad in the Riverlands. She's passed from one captor to another, forced from one identity to the next, never getting where she wants to go. So, as much as Arya's story is about her quest to punish those who do wrong, the Hound for killing the butcher's boy, Cersei and Joff for killing her dad, it is as much, if not more, about Arya's own identity, about how politics have robbed her of her own name and how war has made her unsafe, no matter whose name, whose face she wears. In a very real sense, Arya can never be safe to be herself without some measure of vengeance or retribution. After all, her idols are dead and her enemies are in power. So Arya's story becomes a horror story, where her vengeance is driven by a constant combination of death, fear, and displacement from herself.
Excellent. So, guys, what makes it a vengeance arc or story, and how do we see this vengeful behaviour by your character manifesting? Lady Gwyn.
Well, I think maybe we could draw a distinction between revenge, retaliation for perceived wrong being a finite thing, just sort of one and done. You've got your revenge, you move on. Whereas vengeance is more of a process. The words are essentially synonyms, but I think there's a subtle difference that leads us towards this concept of the vengeance arc, where someone is progressing towards achieving revenge. And along the way, they're more likely going to engage in self-destructive and antisocial behaviors. And Sandor Clegane really checks all those boxes. He's consumed with killing his brother, and since his brother is Gregor, he's learned to bide his time, but he states his goals repeatedly. And I think the elder brother's description of Sandor to Brienne really sums up everything about him best. So that's almost the best answer to this question, is just turn it over to the elder brother. If even half of what he heard was true, the hound was a bitter, tormented soul, a sinner who mocked both gods and men. He served but found no pride in service. He fought but took no joy in victory. He drank to drown his pain in a sea of wine. He did not love, nor was he loved himself. It was hate that drove him. Though he committed many sins, he never sought forgiveness. Where other men dream of love or wealth or glory, this man, Sandor Clegane, dreamed of slaying his own brother, a sin so terrible it makes me shudder just to speak of it. Yet that was the bread that nourished him, the fuel that kept his fires burning. Ignoble as it was, the hope of seeing his brother's blood upon his blade was all this sad and angry creature lived for. And even that was taken from him when Prince Oberyn of Dorne stabbed Sir Gregor with a poisoned spear. So I think the biggest question that we could ask at this point about Sandor is if he's done with vengeance, assuming that he now believes his brother to be dead. More on that shortly.
Yeah, so I think vengeance is really a theme, but when this theme is so closely intertwined with character development and the core identity of a character, so much so that we can't really separate vengeance from the character, you could look at it as a vengeance arc. Vengeance is poisonous and infectious, and it can take over a person and become their raison d'etre and the character goal. This is what happened with Stoneheart. I will note that the BWB are looking for Arya, so they do actually have other objectives aside from vengeance, but it's clear that Stoneheart is going to kill Freys indiscriminately. She will stop at nothing to avenge Robb and destroy Walder, and ultimately she's prepared to kill young, innocent Podrick Payne. She breaks safe passage customs when the BWB kills a hostage, and then the ransomer in the Merit epilogue. Catelyn had put her faith in guest right, showing she had respect for customs, but with Stoneheart the gloves are off, and there might not be much she won't do to satisfy her thirst for vengeance. She's responding to being the victim of unconscionable behaviour by becoming awful herself. This may be fantasy and she's being resurrected and so on, but I think there's something very human about wanting to respond to being wronged by inflicting some of that wrong back in the opposite direction.
Yeah, as you guys have already touched on, the vengeance arc really transcends that singular act and becomes about the journey. We're focused on Oberyn today. The vengeance arc that he is part of starts over a decade before the events, and it continues well past his death. His quest is picked up, or rather continued, because many were already involved, by the surviving family members. As Oberyn isn't a POV character, we're introduced to his arc when Tyrion rides out to meet him and finds out that, hey, guess what? Prince Doran's not here. He sent the Red Viper. Immediately, this creates tension in the story between Lannister and Martell, with Oberyn saying, oh, I came for justice for Elia and her children, and I will have it. Starting with that lummox Gregor Clegane, but not, I think, ending there. Before he dies, the enormity that rides will tell me from whence came his orders. Please assure your Lord Father of that. We, of course, know where the story goes from here. He doesn't ultimately get that entire confession, but he does get some level of confession before his death. In terms of where this arc is going, I won't dig into it in too much detail because I think, to me, this is one of the biggest wild cards of the series. You've got all these sand snakes who all, for right now, seem like they're kind of, all right, we'll follow the plan, but we'll see how long that lasts, how many chapters that lasts.
I mentioned before that in Arya's story, I think George R. Martin is playing with the horror genre. And I think in Arya's arc, George R. Martin is also showing a lot of his lapsed Catholicism. And the vengeance arc story we get looks a lot like a descent into hell and an exploration of death, judgment, and reckoning through the theme of vengeance. When Arya exchanges Valar Morghulis and Jaqen H'ghar's iron coin for passage to the House of Black and White, she's leaving behind the metaphorical hell of the Riverlands in favor of a descent into literally the underworld itself. Arya is turning towards violence and death because, as I hit on before, she already feels dead. For Arya, she moves through hell into a purgatory, where her soul, what is left of it anyway, and her desires will be judged. This reminds me of a quotation from George R. Martin explaining his thoughts on the horror genre in Dream Songs. Martin says, "Good horror stories make us look at our reflections in dark, distorting mirrors, where we glimpse things that disturb us, things that we do not really want to look at. Horror looks into the shadows of the human soul, at all the fears and rages that live within us all." So George R. Martin's vengeance arc for Arya is like Dante's Inferno. It's an exploration of the horror of the sin of vengeance and the horror that it wreaks on the human heart.
Excellently put. And so let's talk about the costs of vengeance. So what is the cost to the character of bearing this enormous load of these impulses to indulge in revenge? Emma.
I'll go first. I think, at first brush, the answer is obvious for me. Oberyn, of course, pays the ultimate price for his quest for vengeance. While he's arguably somewhat successful, and at least part of his aims, that need for confession that he had is what opened him up to losing his fight. He could have ended Clegane faster, we believe, but instead he really wants that confession. He and ultimately pays the price for it. However, I think, unfortunately for his family, they're not potentially done paying this price. We see Oberyn's eldest three daughters just instantly consumed with this need to avenge their father. They don't care that it was trial by combat. They don't care about what Doran's saying about it, technically being an honorable death and Oberyn knowing what he was doing there. They want war. They want an assassination. They want, they want to pick up this mantle and continue. With really different approaches. We see also the grief that the death brings in Arya and Doran and Arianne, and her POV thinks about him quite a bit. Of course, the daughters as well. We haven't really touched at all on how the rest of Dorne responds. We hear that there's calls in the street for vengeance, that they're up in arms, that they're crying out for that. And I think that George is trying to paint a really clear picture to us that seeking vengeance can never be anything better than bittersweet because of how that quest is going to impact and shape everyone else who's touched by it, usually not in the most positive way.
So for Sandor, I think the cost was arguably himself, his dreams, any chance he ever had at a normal life. Those things all perished in the flames of, that initial wounding by his brother and his subsequent rage. I think George makes that manifest in A Feast for Crows when he draws a distinction between the Hound. The Hound is dead and Sandor Clegane is at rest. The Hound was the persona that Sandor assumed so that he could achieve his vengeance. The sigil of his house isn't derived from just any dogs. These were hunting dogs that had the power to take down a lion. And, Sandor needed to have the strength to take down a mountain. So his alter ego was born, the Hound. He gave himself to the journey so fully that when Gregor died, the Hound literally lost his own raison d'etre, and he perished as well, allegedly. So,
Yeah, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on in Lady Stoneheart's head, because she's been brought back from the dead and we've lost her POV, but clearly when she kills Jingle Bell, the tone is set. Catelyn's soul and the essence of her true personality is really lost due to the extreme trauma she felt witnessing Rob's murder. George also gives us clues to her mental state via her appearance. I'm just going to read from the Merit epilogue the introduction we get to her. The flesh had gone pudding soft in the water and turned the colour of curdled milk. Half her hair was gone, and the rest had turned as white and brittle as a crow's. Beneath her ravaged scalp, her face was shredded skin and black blood, where she had raked herself with her nails. But her eyes were the most terrible thing. Her eyes saw him, and they hated. So obviously, in the last line about the eyes are the window to the soul, so we understand that Stoneheart is absolutely consumed with hatred. It can't be nice to be her. There can be no joy in such an existence. I think the reader really gets that straight away. Unlike other vengeful characters, there is no respite for her and no chance she's going to change. This incarnation of Catelyn is too far gone, and consequently she seems inhuman.
So I think with Arya, particularly in the House of Black and White, George R. R. Martin is giving us another explicit variation of the idea that vengeance costs oneself and one's humanity. The best illustration of this is comes from a quotation from I think it's the Kindly Man, when she is training to become a faceless assassin. He says, "Stay, and the many-faced God will take your ears, your nose, your tongue. He will take your sad gray eyes that have seen so much. He will take your hands, your feet, your arms, your legs, your private parts. He will take your hopes, your dreams, your loves and hates. Those who enter his service must give up all that makes them who they are. Can you do that?" What's intriguing to me about this for Arya is that she's already been forced to give up so much of her identity before she's even reached the House of Black and White. And now, to fulfill her quest for vengeance, Arya is actively going to erase herself in the pursuit of the power to vanquish her enemies. That's the bargain that she is offered. So with Arya, we also get an interrogation, I think, of the cost of not engaging in personal vengeance, of becoming an instrument of death rather than an agent. I think Needle is a very fascinating representation of this conflict. A needle is literally a kind of double-edged sword, two pointy ends, one that represents for Arya her memories and her love and family, Jon Snow's smile and her Stark identity, but this symbol of love is also a literal instrument of violence, linking love to vengeance. To become no one, a trained faceless assassin, an instrument of the god of death, she must give this up. She must give us up Needle who she is. So she resists by bearing Needle and retaining her identity. Killing Darien for Northern Stark justice and later wrath are an assertion of her identity through the act of vengeance.
Excellent. So why don't we get into more speculative territory and maybe make a few predictions on where we're going to go. Where do you see your character's vengeance theme going in future volumes, and will there be a resolution to this urge for vengeance? Why don't you go, Lady Gwyn?
Yeah, so here we go. Sandor, as I said, is subtly presented in Feast as being at rest, and it's said that his quest for vengeance has been made null and void by the death of his brother at Oberyn Martell's hands. So you have to wonder what's going to happen when word reaches him about Robert Strong, as it surely will. Will he see through the ruse immediately? Will the mere thought that perhaps his brother still lives be enough to rouse him from his rest and send him out to resume his quest? I do think so, I think he will go out as Sandor Clegane, and I think the Hound is gone on some really important level. He's may finally become himself, but I don't think that this is a character who's got a happy or peaceful ending coming. He might achieve his goal, but as has been the case for his entire life, the ultimate price is going to be his own life. So it continues to be a cautionary tale against this consuming quest for vengeance.
I think, well, it's clear, I think everyone knows, Stoneheart's vengeance story will be taken to an extreme. We might be headed towards a sort of stomach-churning climax when she finally makes Walder Frey pay for scheming and bringing down her son. It's unlikely there will be a resolution before that point, because it would kind of make her plot line pointless. You know, why introduce her and not take it in the direction you're going? So by making her so inhuman, George can have her leading the BWB to do things beyond the pale. Many readers want to see vengeance against Walder and other Freys instrumental in the treachery of the Red Wedding. George wants us to be tempted by revenge, to root for it. But when it finally goes down, I don't think we can expect to like the taste of vengeance. In a Game of Thrones, when Cat is bargaining with Walder Frey to cross the river, she has an interesting thought that just seems to come out of nowhere. It says, Catelyn would gladly have spitted the old man and roasted him over a fire, but she had only until evenfall to open the bridge. So she's, just from nowhere, she's thinking about spitting the old man and roasting him alive, which is just, to me, a very strange line that seemed out of place. So there is a lot of these lines of foreshadowing in the first book, so I wondered if this could be foreshadowing. The notion of Stoneheart roasting Freys is a really interesting one, given the story of the Rat Cook. The Rat Cook outlines the custom of guest right, which is obviously so pertinent to her, and revolves around forced cannibalism. If there's a Red Wedding 2.0, as many in the fandom believe, this could be the dark climax. Walder being spitted and served up, just like the three Freys, Rhaegar, Symond, and Jared were in the Frey pies. So we expect to be disgusted if this comes to pass. I don't think we're going to be enjoying revenge on Walder Frey as much as we would like to be enjoying it.
I think Arya is going to have to confront Stoneheart, whether metaphorically or literally, at some point in the story. Arya through Nymeria is responsible for creating Lady Stoneheart. So it seems to me that part of Arya's reckoning with vengeance in her arc is going to need to be a confrontation of the idea of these extrajudicial killings that both Lady Stoneheart and Arya have been engaging in for vengeance. But I think the big place that I see Arya's story going, I parallel Arya's kind of hero's journey story arc to Odysseus in the Odyssey. And I think that has some really interesting implications for Arya's ultimate return to Westeros, and maybe also to Winterfell, and how we understand her relationship to vengeance. So in the Odyssey, after all of his wanderings, Odysseus returns home to Ithaca. He's disguised as a beggar, and what's the first thing that he has to do? Well, he plots revenge with his son against all the suitors that are ruining his home. And that's a quintessential classic mythological vengeance story. And I think Arya will have a very similar culmination to her story, some ultimate kind of purging, cleansing vengeance of her home. And it will be centered on both her return home and I think her return to her Stark self, her return to her own identity as Arya Stark from her wanderings as the stranger.
Yeah, to me, the biggest open question about the continuation of Oberyn's vengeance arc, which is now, I'm just going to call it House Martell's vengeance, is if there's enough unity or cooperation between the remaining players to really pull off more of their plans. and what those plans are specific to kind of revenge upon Tywin and House Lannister. Obviously, within the story, Tywin is dead, but we see that Doran is not sitting still either. In Arya Hota's first chapter, the different temperaments of Prince Doran, Princess Eyrie, and the Sand Snakes are on full display, and they all, right on the offset, seem deeply misaligned in their goals. From there, eventually common ground is found, but it seems tenuous at best that all these strong-willed characters will continue to follow the very cautious Doran's plans, particularly with the shakeups that we know are coming with Aegon's landing and the impending news of Quentin's death that could arrive who knows when. Ironically, despite having this reputation for being vicious and hot-tempered, it seems like Oberyn was actually more willing and capable to plot that kind of slow, careful vengeance with Doran than I think his daughters really believe. A lot of what they say in their dialogue when confronting Prince Doran is, well, Oberyn wouldn't sit still, Oberyn wouldn't do this, and it's revealed that actually they were in a lot more alignment than I think his daughters realized. As George would say, I suppose we'll have to kind of keep reading to see how well the Dornish kind of stick the landing here and stick together as they seek to further topple House Lannister and really confirm the justice and the depths around Sir Gregor, Tywin, etc.
Excellent. So why don't we try and tie what we're all saying about vengeance together going forward? So what is the author trying to tell us about vengeance with your character? What's the common ground between the four of us, Lady Gwyn?
So to begin with the common ground, I think we're dealing with Venn diagrams here, which is one of my favorite things. Oberyn and Stoneheart died achieving their revenge, and jury's still out on others. Arya and Sandor are connected deeply by many things, not the least of which is their mutual focus on Gregor. Arya and Oberyn both think that they want or are motivated by at least justice, while Sandor and Stoneheart are both pretty purely focused on balancing the scales of awfulness with vengeance. So, they all have points of connection, but we've been talking about a continuum, so they kind of line up differently. As for what the author has to say about Sandor specifically in vengeance, I think that, like a lot of Song of Ice and Fire characters, Sandor is a cautionary tale. As I said a few minutes ago, vengeance consumes, and George takes a lot of pains to show us that. And I do wonder about Sandor's present role as gravedigger, because there's an old saying, I believe it's sometimes attributed to Confucius, that if you embark on a journey of vengeance, you should dig 2 graves, one for yourself and one for your target. So whether that's intentional or not, I definitely like the implied symbolism of Sandor digging those graves. I do think he's going to end up in one of them.
Excellent. When you really outlined kind of some of the Venn diagram a bit, so I'll talk a little bit more about the other part of that question about what's George trying to tell us in Oberyn's story. We've spoken so much across all 4 of us about the cycle of vengeance, meaning trouble for more than just the 1 to 2 people who are wrapped up in it. We see Oberyn's surviving kin, as well as they're still surviving Lannisters who certainly weren't the primary target when we first get introduced to this arc, but Cersei is still out there, etc. I think George also is using the relationship between the brothers Oberyn and Doran and their headstrong daughters to highlight that delicate balance between wanting to be a careful planner and also being ready and able to act. While Oberyn is widely known as being dangerous and headstrong, and certainly there's stories about him, when it comes down to actually seeking revenge, he follows a lot more closely with Doran than it seems. His daughters, who are extremely hawkish for war, were not shown, I think, by their father to temper that lust for vengeance the way that he was able to. So whether you think that Doran is this careful schemer playing an epic game of 4D chess, or if you think he's a doddering fool waiting way too long to act, or somewhere in between, I think it's undeniable that these are themes that George is certainly playing with as we march past the death of the Red Viper Dorne and into this new era. One where there's certainly a hope for a brighter future for Dorne and for vengeance for them.
By turning Cat into Stoneheart, George is showing us in an extreme way that revenge can poison anyone. You could be leading a great life at a point and someone could hurt you, and part of you might want revenge. If you indulge in that impulse and then take it too far, you're trading off part of your soul, I think. George has read a lot of history and seen on a macro scale what damage political revenge can do for generations. And the same can be said for us as individuals in our daily lives. I agree with Lady Gwyn that the vengeance stories in A Song of Ice and Fire, especially Stoneheart's, are cautionary tales. George, I said earlier, he's tempting us to root for vengeance and then showing us how dark, grim, and lonely that road can be.
I think with all of these characters, if you look at them through the lens of horror, which is what I've been talking about a lot, you can see how George explores this theme of how vengeance is self-destructive in a duality between the character, the person, and the character, the vengeance monster. Stoneheart literally becomes a zombie. Oberyn is referred to as a Red Viper, but he also has this duel with Gregor, who is a literal monster. Gregor also becomes a literal monster, and Gregor also features largely in the Hound story. And as Lady Gwyn alluded to, the Hound has to die in order for the person, Sandor Clegane, to reemerge. And what I think George R. Martin is playing with here is using these horror themes of monstrosity to look at how vengeance turns us into less of a human. And what I hope for with Arya's arc is to see an integration between Arya, the person, and the part of Arya's soul that's symbolized by Nymeria, the direwolf, that's roaming Westeros, killing at will. And I think that kind of integration, balancing the scales that we sort of started this panel talking about, is part of what George is troubling us to think about. How do we seek justice without losing ourselves? And what I hope for Arya is that Arya doesn't lose herself, and that she's able to integrate her pursuit for justice in a way that allows her to retain her humanity.
There's got to be one happy vengeance story, right?
It stops being a vengeance story and becomes a justice story.
Yeah, go ahead. We've got 5 minutes. Let's chat things out.
Sure. So I guess I want to think about the dichotomy between justice and vengeance. We actually got that in the first book in the aftermath of Robert's Rebellion. Robert was vengeful against Rhaegar. Ned wanted to bring Eyrie to justice. And then we see 15 years later what Robert became, and then Ned was well-adjusted and wanted to stay happy in the North, right? Just want you guys' ideas on that.
No, it's a good comment. Anyone else got any more comments? Well, go on, Frank.
Yeah, so George's policy, as the panel pointed out, kind of manifests as, vengeance is probably not a great idea. But you often see him kind of at least aware of how seductive it is. So I'm wondering, about how when he has, the northern host saying, let me, say, let me taste molten blood, and then he has, Davos in the merman port saying, what the stance offering, he offers vengeance. And it's kind of a really, fist pump moment, because Davos has been more kind of rational and saying, one king means peace, but now, after the Blackwater and all this, I think, so I guess I'm wondering if we have time, the panel's thoughts on, is George really that anti-vengeance, or is he kind of aware of its ability to be a form of justice as man said?
I think he's playing with the idea that justice is a much harder goal to seek, and that you know, kind of that lust for vengeance is seductive. You know, it feels better to think about in the moment, like seeing all your enemies die horrible deaths, than to kind of go through that tedious, oftentimes difficult, oftentimes impossible to accomplish task. I mean, we talked about some characters who really don't have a path for justice, and that's why they turn to vengeance. But I think we also see it employed as a way to kind of, like you said, like hype people up to get them to buy in, because, you know, saying, oh, we'll have, you know, the Westeros version of like Nuremberg trials after this, and we'll short it all. It doesn't sound as exciting as like, let's bathe in some blood, you know?
I mean, I think that George likes to pose questions more than he likes to give answers. And I think George wants us to pose the exact question that you posed, Frank, because there are times when some form of vengeance, it's not just that it feels good, it seems like some kind of retribution is necessary. And I think I kind of alluded to that being something that he explores in Arya's story. That's part of the human heart in conflict with itself, is that there's not an answer to the question of how much punishment is too much that we can apply easily to any situation. We know what the extremes are. Martin's showing us the extremes, but he's also showing us all these shades in between and asking us to draw our own conclusions. There's not an answer. I wish we had it figured out, but like government and things would be much better if we did.
Yeah, definitely vengeance is on a scale, and Davos calling, you know, trying to rally the troops is different from Stoneheart trying to extinguish every single Frey indiscriminately. So, yeah, when we say, oh, vengeance is bad, you still got to acknowledge that there's a lighter shade that incorporates justice somewhat.
Slippery slope.
Yeah, it's a slope for sure. If you get into it too far, you're going to, you know, cause problems for yourself.
So this is actually a question for Mary. I'm wondering, sorry for the spot. I'm wondering with Arya's, I like to describe her like her horror story of lost humanity in particular. If her story does go back to reclaiming humanity, reclaiming identity, how would meeting and possibly killing Stoneheart, how would that either support or undermine her reclamation of humanity?
So, I mean, I've read that quotation that horror stories make us look at our reflections in dark, distorting mirrors. Lady Stoneheart is Arya's reflection in this dark, distorting mirror. So the hope is that by confronting Stoneheart in some way or another, she sees the distorted version of herself that she's becoming and is able to take some action to remedy that. You know, in the show, you get Arya like sailing off in the ocean. And I love that for Arya, because I think that's an example of, after everything Arya's been through, after all her struggle to reclaim her identity, what she needs to do is something entirely different. That's her way, potentially, to find peace. And that's the opposite of a vengeance monster, because vengeance is backward looking. It's always looking back, trying to fix something, versus building something new. So that's maybe in confronting Stoneheart, she's able to, her ultimate story takes her somewhere like in the show.
Last question, go for it. Yeah, I definitely think that, you know, it reflects on the society that they're in, that no one is getting a justice. But, you know, Ned tried, he tried, but look what happened. The reality is that, you know, that a lot of Westeros is lawless, especially in the time of war, where everyone is just doing whatever the hell they want to do. So. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this Vengeance panel. Thank you for coming.